Hi, everyone. Today I'd like to speak a little bit about the First Amendment in terms of religious liberty. As one of the goals of Liberty University's history department is to see history through a Christian lens and to also see how Christianity impacted history, as well as how history impacted Christianity, this gives us a great opportunity to do so. One of the main arguments that I'd like to make here is based on two misconceptions. One is that oftentimes we feel the First Amendment is meant to apply at the state level, that it is prohibiting religion and faith in all aspects of state government and relationships of the state government to schools, etc. And it was really never meant to apply at the state level, partially, as we'll see in this discussion, that it was trying to give that power back to the people. And as a result, that also means give that power back to the state to make decisions based on whether or not they would have an established church, whether or not they would fund religious schools, etc. The other is a misconception that the First Amendment was aimed at taking faith out of government in totality. And that was also never the case, and we still see many of our presidents and elected officials discuss their own personal beliefs, etc. And so, based on those two misconceptions, that's the argument in relation to how we saw that and perceived that in the First Amendment. And you see that our interpretation of the First Amendment during the early part of the 19th century is probably much more accurate to what the founders' intent was for it. Before we went in too far into the 19th century, I thought it was interesting to kind of discuss the precedents and reasons for the First Amendment, and that will lend itself to a greater understanding of how people perceived that during the 19th century. One of the precedents is the 1779 Virginia Bill establishing religious freedom in that state particularly. And what it did is it prohibited discrimination based on religious belief, prohibited churches from being established or funded through taxpayer money, and also prohibited religious tests for participation in civil government. But if we look at the 19th century interpretations, a great one to begin with is Daniel Humphries. His words were published in the Inquirer in 1801. And what Humphries discusses is the fact that no government in history has really ever been truly able to successfully coerce a society to believe or practice a certain faith. And a great example that he notes is the Protestant Reformation, of course, right, where Catholics spoke out against the practices of the Catholic Church, stating that they were not in line with Scripture. And as a result, we would see the proliferation of Protestant denominations, much of which was the catalyst for the conflict that we would see between those denominations in the New World that would continue into the 19th century. John White Jr. in the Facts and Fictions about History of Separation of Church and State also makes the argument that there are two, everyone was very much aware, both our founders as well as individuals who interpreted the First Amendment in the 19th century, aware of the fact that history has proven that oftentimes government has the tendency to corrupt the church, as well as how the church also has a tendency to corrupt government. Right? And so in that source, what essentially he argues is that they understood the need for the First Amendment, but they understood the limitations of the First Amendment as well. Right? Because if they're trying to give that power back to the people or the states, then the First Amendment should really not apply to those states if they're giving that power back. We see, as a result, a plurality in terms of denominations during the 19th century context. And of course, this would lead to disagreement. And it's interesting, for instance, James Madison's words are published in the Massachusetts Missionary Baptist Magazine in 1811. And there he's talking about the positive attributes of religious liberty. Very similarly, Thomas Jefferson's letter to the Danbury Baptists in 1802. And he also discusses the need for faith and religion in creating a more moral society. But what's so intriguing is Baptists are a common theme. And this is partially because of the persecution that they saw as being dissenters in, for instance, New England during the 18th century. And that denominational conflict would continue in places like New England into the 19th century. some of the effects of interpretations such as Jefferson's wall of separation are interesting because, as Joanne Neem points out in Beyond the Wall, Reinterpreting Jefferson's Danbury Address, what this author argues is that while Jefferson had hoped to spread or perpetuate a more liberty-focused society in terms of religious denominations, and hopefully ultimately what the author argues is Jefferson wanted to see a more cohesive or unified society based on religion. What the author also argues is that he inadvertently contributed to a more pluralistic society that was confident in their differences, right? And as a result, this would also lead to denominational conflict during the time period that we're discussing. Daniel Dreisbach has done quite a bit of work on the interpretations of the First Amendment throughout multiple centuries. And in The Mythical Wall of Separation, How a Misused Metaphor Changed the State, Church, Law, Policy, and Discourse, this author argues that Jefferson's wall of separation interpretation was no different than the federalism interpretations we saw that would apply to other aspects of a federal and state relationship. So federalism we're all familiar with, where it has well-defined roles between the federal government and the state government, ultimately meant to give that power back to the state government. In terms of religion, what the author argues, this is absolutely no different. What the author also argues is that this interpretation was never meant to take faith out of government, right? And so a great example the author uses is that Jefferson endorsed the use of federal funds to build churches to support Christian missionaries' work among Indians, right? And we also see that most individuals during this time, and continue to do so, truly understand that making sure there is no established church among the federal government did not mean that faith was supposed to be absent, right, according to the First Amendment. And we see this, for instance, with George Washington's Proclamation 6, a day of public thanksgiving, where Washington states, "The happy course of our public affairs in general, the unexampled prosperity of all classes of our citizens, are circumstances which peculiarly mark our situation with indications of essentially God's work, divine work." In 1798, John Adams would also recommend a national day of humiliation, fasting, and prayer. And so we see that most of our founding fathers, of our presidents, and individuals into the 19th century understood that the First Amendment was never, its goal or intentions were never to take faith out of having a central role in society or government. What were some of the effects in the 19th century? Because everyone understands, and most scholars argue, that religion and faith needed to be present in society in many contexts, partially to create a more ethical and moral society. So what did this all boil down to? And of course, this boils down to the argument not based on First Amendment rights, but based on the conflict between the plurality of denominations. That's where you see the main arguments occurring, or why you see the main arguments occurring during the 19th century in each state level. And partially because if the federal government does not prohibit a state from having an established church or anything like that, it would mean that, of course, you would see conflict. Kelly Olds, in Privatizing the Church, De-establishment in Connecticut and Massachusetts, gives a great overview of this. So Connecticut would de-establish their church in 1818. Massachusetts would soon follow, partially because of the work of the Toleration Party. What is the argument in all of this? And what we see based on the sources is the argument is, if we are going to have individuals paying taxes to fund churches, right, shouldn't we fund churches more than one church, more than, for instance, the Congregational Church? Because you have members that are funding these churches who are not, or excuse me, individuals who are funding these churches who are not members. That's where you see this main conflict, and as a result, the effect is to de-establish, to privatize these churches. What the point here is that nowhere is the First Amendment present in this argument, right? Samuel Pleasance, also in the church and state and public school system, suggests that in the 19th century, you don't see the First Amendment in terms of religious liberties being a restriction. It's not until the actual 20th century, in 1947, you see the first Supreme Court case that utilizes the First Amendment's religious liberties as a restriction on this relationship between the state and, for instance, funding schools that are religiously oriented. And Mark Knoll also gives a great overview. A great example, for instance, is in New York, where public schools are funded with tax dollars. We're using textbooks that were perpetuating Protestant ideology. And Bishop John Hughes, a huge advocate for Catholics during the mid-19th century, makes the argument that if we're, similarly to the churches, if we're going to fund these public schools that are spreading Protestant ideals, should we not also fund Catholic schools, right, to create a more equitable society? Of course, Bishop John Hughes would fail in his noble attempt, but it once again illustrates the idea that no one is challenging the concept that funding religious-oriented schools, having an established church, none of that is violating the First Amendment. It is simply a conflict that we want a more equitable society if we are going to have those relationships between state governments and churches or religious institutions. Finally, Jose Casanova, in the Roman and Catholic in America and the Transformation of Catholicism in the United States, gives a great overview of what the First Amendment really, how it was interpreted during that time, what it was really aimed at. And aside from the fact that the First Amendment was meant to ensure there was no established church at the federal level, because of the history, because of the interpretation that we see during the 19th century, which everyone was aware of the conflict throughout both the Old World as well as the New. What Casanova argues is, aside from that, its main aim was religious liberties, right? To give individuals who had seen persecution in colonial America and before the right to practice openly, right, their religion. And so aside from focusing on the individuals, really that's why you see that it is never really applied at the state level, because not that it's not protecting individual liberties, but rather because it is protecting individual liberties, right? And as a result, you would not see the interpretation that many of us are familiar with and hear in the news until the 20th century and 21st century, because of course, individuals during the founding of America, during the early 19th century, were products of their time, right? And we're much more familiar with the main purpose and intent of the First Amendment in terms of religious liberties. Thank you for your time.